Queer Meet Anarchism, Anarchism Meet Queer, by C.B. Deric, J. Rogue, Abbey Volcano, and Deric Shannon. From Queering Anarchism, Addressing and Undressing Power and Desire, by C.B. Deric, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text from theanarchistlibrary.org. The purpose of this book is an introduction of sorts, an introduction to meanings of the word. Queer politics and anarchism have not been completely disconnected on the ground, but finding texts that draw these relations can be a difficult task. We think queer politics and anarchism have a lot to offer each other, and we're excited by some of the connections being drawn between the two by people in their writing, organizing, struggling, and daily lives. So, we want to suggest that an introduction to the overlaps between anarchist and queer politics could be useful at this juncture. We also mean introduction in a different sense of the word. That is, we'd like more of our anarchist comrades to be acquainted with queer politics, and we'd like more of our queer friends to be familiar with anarchism. Again, because we think these connections can be particularly fruitful. We hope that this collection can be an introduction in the sense of two ideas meeting one another, or perhaps getting to know one another better, as we don't mean to suggest that queers and anarchists are two distinct and separate groups. They're not. Nor do we really want to suggest that queers or anarchists necessarily always have a decent grasp of queer and anarchist politics respectively. So to be clear, we're not suggesting this idea is particularly novel. There are already many folks doing this work. If we just look at the last 5 years or so, from Bash Back to Black and Pink to Queers Without Borders, to name just a few, groups with a variety of theories, practices, and lives have been staking out space within the larger project of queering anarchism. Indeed, people with varying levels of involvement in each of these groups, and more, have contributed to the collection you now hold in your hands. We put together this volume to help draw out some of the propositions and debates within this overlap. And importantly, we tried to collect pieces that were not written for an academic audience. Much of queer theoretical writing is dense and difficult. While we feel that dense and difficult texts have their place, we wanted to provide a collection for a general audience. That said, we'd like to begin the book with some short introductions of our own. Anarchism is littered with misinformation and distortions, so any text introducing materials on anarchism might include a brief explanation of where the authors are coming from. Similarly, anarchism is admittedly a diverse milieu, not a unified movement. So while the editors of this volume don't have a strict and singular unity on the meanings and dimensions of anarchism, we do hope that briefly sketching out what we mean by the term can serve as a method of making sense of the contents of this volume for readers unfamiliar with anarchism. Similarly, queer is a contested term, used in a number of different ways, and requires a bit of unpacking. We don't hope to resolve large debates within anarchist, queer, and anarchist queer communities about these definitions, meanings, and so on, but rather hope to provide some insight on the pieces in this particular volume and, with any luck, provide a framework for continuing much-needed discussion with this short introduction. Anarchism. Many volumes have been written throughout history explicating anarchism, and the movement has seen many historical periods of retreat and resurgence. We're living in a resurgence of interest in anarchist ideas right now. It's a common trope that after the Battle of Seattle in 1999, when a loose coalition of environmentalists, trade unionists, anarchists, feminists, and many others shut down the World Trade Organization conference, anarchism has seen a bit of a rebirth, often connected with the anti- and alter-globalization movements. Similarly, the Occupy Wall Street movement was initiated by anarchists, among others, and has had a heavy anarchist involvement, and mainstream news media, in both instances, have often demonized anarchists and spread misinformation about us. This is certainly nothing new. Alexander Berkman, as far back as 1929, in his introduction to anarchism, exclaimed that anarchism has many enemies. They won't tell you the truth about it. Newspapers and publications, the capitalistic press, are against it. As such, he started his book with a list of what anarchism is not. It is not bombs, disorder, or chaos. It is not robbery and murder. It is not a war of each against all. It is not a return to barbarism or to the wild state of man. Anarchism is the very opposite of all that. Anarchism means that you should be free, that no one should enslave you, boss you, rob you, or impose on you. There is a rather long history of anarchism being distorted, and many anarchist writers have spent considerable years trying to clear up these misconceptions. The urge to destroy. Nevertheless, attempts to paint anarchism in purely peaceful terms miss out on its destructive impulse. By this, of course, we don't mean that anarchists revel in wanton destruction like mainstream media often depicts in their caricatures of anarchists. But anarchists do hold a critique of the existing society, and attempting to hide or ignore this puts unnecessary limits on anarchism. We might discuss anarchism in terms of what it seeks to destroy and negate. The anarchist analysis of our present society, for example, has always held that capitalist property relations are based on a legalized robbery of sorts. That is, we allow, and our laws defend, a system in which things like housing, food, water, the things that everyone needs access to in order to live dignified lives of their own choosing, are privately owned and sold for profit. Similarly, we allow the means of producing these things, and everything else too, to be owned privately. And when most of us go to work, we make the owners of these things even wealthier through our labor. Anarchists propose to negate this legalized robbery, the system that we call capitalism. We also live in societies in which we are alienated from the means of decision-making. While we are typically rented by bosses in our working lives, we are ruled by political bosses elsewhere. If we go against the dictates of these political bosses, we can be beaten, kidnapped, caged, or even killed by police. And the decisions that affect our lives are made by politicians that ostensibly represent us. Anarchists argue that we should negate political representation, the institution that we call the state. Anarchism also argues for alterations to ourselves. And anarchists in the past have suggested that the process of negating our institutions also involves a process of changing our daily lives and understandings of the world. Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta, for example, wrote that, quote, between man and his social environment, there is a reciprocal action. Men make society what it is, and society makes men what they are. And the result is therefore a kind of vicious circle. To transform society, men must be changed, and to transform men, society must be changed. End quote. This means fighting against, and in some instances, unlearning relations of domination, including, but not limited to, racism, ableism, sexism, heterosexism, and so on. Anarchists then argue that we negate all aspects of power over others. The systematization of domination we often refer to as hierarchy. So anarchists do, in fact, embody a destructive urge, an urge to end domination, to smash power over others, to destroy the means to which working people are robbed and exploited. This communicates a negative aspect of anarchism. Attempts to gloss over these, oftentimes for the purposes of populist messaging, miss out on anarchism's rich history of bravely combating systems of exploitation and relations of domination. But it is true that anarchism is not simply a negative project. In addition to what anarchists oppose, we might also look at what anarchists are for. It is also a creative urge. While it's important to acknowledge that anarchists wish to break with the existing society and contain within them a negative politics, it's also important to recognize that historically, anarchists have had a generative politics. That is, within destruction is also creation. So anarchism is also a creative endeavor. This has been demonstrated historically through anarchist attempts to create alternative institutions, or, in the words of the IWW, build a new world in the shell of the old. In place of a system of private property and systematized robbery, anarchists have proposed a social ownership of society, or alternatively stated, the abolition of property altogether. This might sound absurd in a society that treats property as sacrosanct, but anarchists put forward a specific definition of property: ownership claims on those things that one neither occupies nor uses. Anarchists usually juxtapose this with possessions, or those things that we use or the homes that we live in, i.e., no anarchist wants to take your home or guitar away. This is how bosses and landlords exploit workers, by claiming to own the things they do not use, or the places in which they do not live, then extracting rents and value from the people who do actually use them. In place of private ownership, anarchists put forward visions of a social system in which we produce for the needs of the people instead of the profits of capitalists. Similarly, instead of a state that stands above society, directing it, anarchists typically propose federations and neighborhood assemblies, workplace associations, community councils, and the like, as coordinating bodies comprised by the people. We would collectively make decisions that affect our lives, rather than having those decisions made for us by politicians or left to the whims of the market. Functions of safety and collective decision-making, then, would be organized through networks of participatory communities based on self-government through direct, face-to-face democracy in grassroots neighborhood and community assemblies, instead of representation, police, prisons, in a word, bureaucracy. And in the place of hierarchical social relations, anarchists propose a human community based on autonomy, solidarity, and mutual aid. Thus, the struggle against the state and capitalism must simultaneously be a struggle against white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and all forms of oppression and exploitation. Anarchists propose a society based on a highly egalitarian ethos because no human being should be granted power and control over others. So, anarchists argue, it must be understood that the war against capitalism must be at the same time a war against all institutions of political power, because exploitation has always gone hand in hand with political and social oppression. Replacing white supremacy, a world constructed for so-called able bodies, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and all relations of domination, would be new sets of social relations that do not arrange groups hierarchically in terms of their access to economic, political, and cultural power. This very brief introduction is only meant to provide a broad look at anarchism, and we suggest to anyone who is interested to check out the many anarchist websites, books, magazines, etc., to find out about it themselves. Some anarchists might take issue with our portrayal above. As we said, anarchism is a diverse milieu. We want to be upfront about that, so as not to portray ourselves as speaking for the milieu when we are speaking to our own interpretations of it. Queer. Queer is likewise a contested term. Historically, it was often used to describe something that seems strange or not quite right. In more contemporary times, it was, and is, used as a slur against people who are perceived to be lesbian and or gay, particularly effeminate men. In contemporary usage, it is often used as a reclaimed sort of shorthand for various identities contained in the LGBT alphabet soup, themselves contested groupings of sexual minorities, with arguments over who rightfully belongs within those identity categories and who might be defined out. Indeed, part of why queer began to be used as shorthand for sexual and gender minorities of all kinds was due to some of these debates over who belonged, in what contexts, and how we might think about our sexual and gendered selves in ways that weren't based on identities. This explosion in writing about theory, bodies, gender, desire, sexuality, and much more is often referred to as queer theory, with a simultaneous queer politics emerging on the ground, oftentimes in similar historical moments. Groups such as ACT UP and Queer Nation, events such as the roving Queer Eruption festivals, and so on, often reflected radical changes in how participants thought about the limits of identity. These were tailed by the building of queer theory, which put identity categories under a critical lens. Some of the explosion of queer theory is rooted in the works of French intellectual Michel Foucault. In his famous study of sexuality, Foucault found that the homosexual as an identity could be traced to the rise of sexual science in mid-19th century. Thus, the homosexual was an invention. This didn't mean that there wasn't same-sex sexual activity before the mid-19th century, but that where before we had an activity, it was transformed through complex historical processes into an identity, complete with borders and in some cases, rigid in-groups and out-groups. Something a person does, i.e. an act, was transformed into something a person is, an identity. According to Foucault, the homosexual was created as a species of human, Our available categories of this thing that we came to call sexual orientation became based on this historical process of identity creation, reducing complex desires and relations to gender of a person, and the gender of the people that they desire. This is important because identity is a basic part of how people come to understand themselves and part and parcel of how we become constituted as socially viable beings. These processes of socially constructing identities led to the complete invisibilization of some people, which is another reason for the development of queer theory in politics. Think about it. We are told that we are hetero, homo, or bi, perhaps 100% opposite gender attraction, 100% same gender attraction, or a 50-50 split. This is who we are. A good solid majority of our society has internalized this coding and even made oppressive hierarchies out of it. So understanding sexuality and gender in terms of rigid, easily identifiable, and heavily policed identities effectively invisibilizes and robs people who do not fit neatly into our available identity categories of a viable social existence. Not just for sexuality, but also, and of course, relatedly, for gender and sex. This has meant pushing out people whose sexual desires are fluid, or whose gender practices or sex didn't make discussions of sexuality coherent, given our limited ranges of choices and self-understandings. It erased people who do not experience their gender in terms of neatly constructed boxes. We needed a much more fluid, elastic, and broad category that was inclusive, and queer was, in many cases, an attempt to create that space and anti-identity, in a sense. Relatedly, queer was a word that could be played with. An adjective and a verb. Queer served as a space for critiquing identity and playing with theory, bodies, power, and desire that didn't need to be reducible to easy definitions. The implications of thinking about sexuality, sex, gender, and a universe of other ideas in relationship to queer theory in politics are still up for much debate. We hope this collection reflects that. Queer has also had a degree of elasticity in use, as a noun, still at times, but also as an adjective and a verb. Aside from a noun, another marker of identity, queer is often used as an adjective, rather than a description of who a person is. In this way, it is typically used as positionality. That is, queer can be seen as a relationship, as a context-defined antagonism to the normal. Halperin, perhaps, describes this best when he writes, quote, "Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence." Queer, then, demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. A positionality that is not restricted to lesbians and gay men, but is in fact available to anyone who is or who feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices. End quote. The normative expectations that exist in society create binary divisions between behaviors deemed normal and abnormal. Whatever behaviors or desires, thoughts, etc. fall into the category labeled normal are dominant, intelligible, visible, and in many cases powerful. Other behaviors will fall into the abnormal category and become subordinate, unintelligible, invisibilized, and suppressed, repressed, and oppressed. What gets labeled normal will affect what gets labeled abnormal. If there are shifts in one sphere, the other sphere will shift with it. Queer, then, is what is at odds with the normal, and lines up with the category of abnormal. Since the normal can change, so can the abnormal, the queer. This is why queer is called a positionality. What is deemed queer is not fixed. It is contextual and related to what is called normal. The reason the term queer, in this sense, isn't restricted to gay or lesbian is because many sexual practices are considered abnormal, some that aren't primarily based on gender, for instance, particular ways of having sex, like BDSM, or particular ways of fashioning or arranging sexual relationships, like non-monogamy or sex work. The normal sexuality in our society isn't just hetero. It is a particular form of heterosexuality, a heterosexuality that has a goal of a happily married couple in a permanent relationship, abiding by the plethora of norms that make up what is referred to as heteronormativity, a very specific type of heterosexuality that reinforces the dominance of the ascribed set of norms: cohabitation, procreation, marriage, monogamous coupling, etc. We might also then analyze queer sexual practices and gender embodiment that recognizes that hierarchies exist within heterosexuality, allowing us a frame to discuss non-monogamy, sex work, BDSM, and so on, both within same-sex relationships and elsewhere. This doesn't mean that all these sexual and gender practices are experienced in the same way or oppressed to the same degree. That too is context-specific and also related to other identities that people might be assigned or the class position that they might inhabit. Rather, it is strategic for all people marginalized and oppressed by heteropatriarchy to organize and struggle together. And that means we need a lens through which to examine a variety of marginalized sexual and gender practices. That does not mean that heteropatriarchy treats all deviants the same. It means that there is no scarcity of liberation, and that if liberation, in the final instance, is going to be meaningful, it must include us all. Further, along with the socially constructed nature of sexuality and gender, as the intersex movement has taught us, we can also put sex under this critical lens. Sex is also put into a binary framework in our society, male and female, which fails to recognize a range of hormonal, sexual, and even chromosomal makeup that people can embody, and importantly, also ignores the coercive nature of the state's attempts to define our sexual selves for us at birth. This allows for a more holistic politics of sex, sexuality, and gender. It also gives us theoretical space to queer or naturalize assumptions about other identities. Consider, for example, people who exist in the margins of available categories for race, and how it can make their existence or identity incoherent, or perhaps changing depending on the context they are in, white in some contexts, perhaps Latino in others, and so on. What might politics look like if we begin looking at identities in ways that do not treat them as fixed, monolithic, and eternal? This antagonistic relationship with the normal has also led to an anti-assimilationist ethic that often sets queer politics apart from mainstream GLBT politics. So the holy trinity of mainstream gay and lesbian politics, same-sex marriage, don't ask, don't tell, and hate crimes legislation are often rejected and critiqued within queer politics. Much of this is reflected as well in queer tendencies toward a radical politics that is critical of the state. After all, the state forcibly assigns us identity categories, and its enforcers mirror the ways the bodies and desires are policed to fit neatly within those categories. The state is also an enforcer of borders in much the same way that our society demands strict and rigid borders around identity. And queer people particularly suffer at the hands of the state in its prisons. Indeed, while part of this ambivalence toward the state is a common trait in queer politics, there is likewise often an ethic of working-class liberation and anti-capitalism within queer communities, linking up nicely with anarchist values. Another reason that a collection such as this is long overdue. This position with regard to the normal is also embedded in how queer is used as a verb, particularly in the process of queering. Since queer theory and politics came primarily out of investigations into sex, sexuality, and gender, oftentimes the word is used to connote adding a needed analysis of them to an already existing theory or set of ideas. So we might start the process of queering anarchism in this way, adding a needed critical analysis of sex, sexuality, and gender where it is often either out of date or simply missing. Likewise, it can be used as a verb to describe the process of making a given set of ideas strange, to destabilize dominant understandings and underlying assumptions. So queering anarchism might also refer to making anarchism strange, creating new understandings of anarchism that redefine it using insights from queer theory and politics. Queering anarchism. In this collection, one can find all these uses of queer as a noun, an adjective, and a verb. Rather than trying to fit all of these pieces into a single, coherent definition of the word, we collected chapters knowing that they would at times be contradictory. For us, the purpose of this book was to create a collection that might move conversations forward, and that meant allowing for a huge range of approaches to queer, as well as a diversity of expressing those approaches. So the reader will also find pieces that queer the script, so to speak, attempting to use creative means to convey ideas outside the format of theoretical essays. This process of collection and editing took over 3 years, spanned changes in the editorial collective, and likewise saw some authors stick with us throughout, and some lose contact with us in that long process. When we first put the idea together, we decided that, like most edited collections, we would create discrete sections for the book. We sought out pieces of theory, writings on practice, and reflections on life experiences. In the end, however, we realized that nearly every chapter contained all 3 of these. So we tried to place them in an order that makes sense, showcases the diversity of thought in the collection, but isn't limited to discrete sections. They'd bleed completely into each other if we tried it anyway. We did, however, try to create an order that would draw out familiar theoretical terrain, and build on that in a process that, with any luck, would give readers a chance to situate the contents better as they travel through these chapters. We begin with Ryan Conrad, who has done quite a lot of work critiquing assimilationist strategies and the equality rhetoric of the mainstream gay and lesbian movement. Conrad uses his critique of these assimilationist goals to suggest that we might expect more than equality under the existing institutions. In fact, we might create a new world. J. Rogue spells out lessons anarchists might learn from the trans-feminist movement, suggesting ways that we might update our feminism and build an anarchist gender politics that is nuanced and holistic. Abbey Volcano pens an intervention into radical queer politics, arguing to be watchful of inverting hierarchies and basing our politics solely on simplified oppositions. Stacy, aka Solidarity, reviews existing theories of gender, drawing out a queer anarchist analysis that can serve as a framework for paths out of our current gender practices and understandings. Jamie Heckert explores ways we might queer anarchism and make it strange. In the process, he expresses a need for a creative politics not solely defined by antagonistic oppositions. Farang Rouhani tells the story of opening a queer social center and the messiness involved in attempting to create and maintain such spaces, where identity categories are simultaneously questioned, created, destabilized, and sometimes celebrated by participants. Jeremy Lessingang ties the struggle against the state together with the liberation of trans people and shows that the state is intimately involved in coercive gendering and gender assignment, suggesting that trans liberation requires the abolition of the state. Next, Benjamin Shepard argues for queering anarchist organizing that might lead us toward a politics of pleasure. This links up nicely with the harm reduction approaches to organizing for better worlds, and thinking about queering politics to provide new ways of conceiving of political interventions. Gage Operesta argues that class struggle must be a central component of queer organizing, asserting in the process that class is not a simple identity, and that we need to organize as a class against capitalism. The CRAC collective queers a script, providing a comic that details conversations among people about how sexual and gender politics relate to their political activity and their lives as radicals and anarchists. Stephanie Grauman investigates how the economy is involved in our contemporary construction of sexuality and gender, and argues that we might queer the economy or shift our understanding of economics to recognize its place in other spheres of life, particularly our gendered and sexual lives. Sandra Jepson provides a personal narrative about how queering anarchism might happen in the lives of people who tend to have heterosexual relationships, but do not identify with straightness and heterosexuality. Finally, Susan Song writes about the intersections between polyamorous sexual practices and relations and anarchist politics. Diana C.S. Becara writes a media analysis of sex in the city, paying close attention to how pop cultural forms construct our understanding of gender and sexuality. She compellingly argues that anarchists might use these kinds of analyses to pinpoint the ways that culture influences our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with others. C.B. Daring argues that anarchists should have an analysis of sex work that doesn't mirror the moralism that is often connected with radical analyses of labor in the sex industry. Jason Linden ties an anarchist queer politics with a need for resisting the prison industrial complex. He puts forward an anarchist queer perspective on abolition. Liat Ben Moshe, Anthony J. Nacella, and A.J. Withers suggest that we recognize parallels between disability and queerness, making the case that we might not just queer anarchism, but queer crypt anarchism, connecting fights against heteronormativity and other forms of oppression and exclusion with struggles against ableism. Sappho Panton Panopoulos contends that straightness is not an identity, but a set of social relations, and for liberation to be total and consistent with anarchist principles, those sets of social relations must be uprooted, exposed, and destroyed. Hex playfully relates BDSM practices to anarchism, using this relationship to draw out kinky paths to queering anarchism. We think the strong connections between anarchist and queer politics are striking, but as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We hope this collection serves as a smorgasbord of sorts, providing insights into how we might alter the landscape of this often miserable, violent, and boring world, and bring into being different ones. We think the case here is supported quite well, that there are many more fruitful engagements to emerge from this meeting of queer and anarchism, and a variety of other partnerships along the way.